elsewhere, because not only do they have to pay for the cost of the bank, they have to pay for the cost of all the bad loans that the bank has made. And I think, frankly, folks, here's the explanation for, we can talk about flows from China and all this sort of stuff like Martin Wolf, but to me, this is the most profound explanation for the crap we've had to deal with in the last 3 years, because here is the desperation of a whole lot of financial institutions in this country, in the United States and in Europe, the desperate effort to get in on the credit markets to actually be able to offer finance as cheaply as they offer before they become outmoded like dinosaurs. Anyway, part of this process of disintermediation is a move of the agencies themselves outside the United States to anticipate growth in capital markets in Europe and Asia. Asia financial crisis, what happens afterwards? Oh, we don't like those banks, they're a big mistake. Let's get capital markets in here. So the agencies are criticised for their role in bringing about the Asian financial crisis, but what does the Asian financial crisis bring? About growth for the agencies. Similar story, frankly, can be told about now, when you have the TARP, when you have financial recovery systems in the United States. The Fed itself has encouraged the use of rating agencies in that process. So, capital market growth basically equals rating industry growth. And now more than ever, a bank which is increasingly acting as a market participant, not as an authority or gatekeeper of finance, wants to get in on this capital market, and politicians and policymakers are aware, therefore, that they have to stimulate the growth of capital markets. They have to provide appropriate institutions for those markets. So what does that mean? It means a great and fertile environment for capital market growth, for rating agency growth. Now, of course, part of this, very recently, has been the hunt for yield in the wake of the 2000 stock market crash and the subsequent reduction of interest rates, this desperate sending of capital, first of all, off to Asia, and then internally in Europe and North America into things like asset-backed securities, right? So all of that's been part of the process too. So financial innovation as well as institutional transformation has been central to the extension of the role of these institutions. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about key problems. Now, these are not the problems that I think are the problems, but they are the problems that everybody else thinks are the problems. So, there we go. Certainly there's an established talk or chatter about the agencies going back 30 years or so. So the conversation that we've had about the agencies in the last 3 years in the media and in the journals and so on is nothing new. The standard critique of the past was that the agencies were backward-looking and therefore were regarded as too slow. More recently, in the 1990s, the agencies, especially Moody's, engaged in quite aggressive sort of market opening activities, if you want to call it that, by issuing unsolicited ratings. So instead of, negotiating with an Italian food company to issue a rating on a bond issue, Moody's just went ahead and did a rating in an unsolicited way. And of course this stimulated US Justice Department action, which sought a legal solution. That action was unsuccessful. Traditionally, I think Moody's and S&P have stood behind a defence of First Amendment rights in the United States, i.e. free speech. And I think that really, it's interesting, I think that really speaks to a lot of the problems here. These are not actually financial institutions, they're not. They're not actually investment advisors either. They are, at some level, they're a bunch of journalists, that's what they are. And I think that that helps them, but it obviously hinders the policy system's response to them because it just stumbles over this. I think, Well, I think the concern was that Moody's was behaving contrary to the Sherman Antitrust Act, that it was a monopolist. It was using its powers to coerce people in the market. And they were unsuccessful. Now, another thing that occurred, Fitch, which had sort of existed, I think, from about 1920, but would sort of go dormant for years on end, a bit like sort of some car companies or, I don't know, universities or whatever, I don't know. Publishers, relaunched itself in the early 90s. And there were concerns, I think, rightly, I think, perhaps, that this might lead to rating shopping. Because if you are generally required to produce or have two ratings on your bond, and there's a third agency that can offer ratings, then certainly there is the potential for game playing there as Fitch tries to get a greater share of the market. I did actually have a Fitch executive say to me, I think she was going to retire fairly soon, that indeed was their business strategy, was to rate about one click more generously than Moody's and S&P. So now, though the sort of background concerns, I guess, rating shopping, unsolicited ratings, kind of backwardness, if you will, a historical view of rating. More recently, I think, with rating crises, such as the Asian financial crisis, the Enron bankruptcy, and the global financial crisis that we're experiencing today, I think the concern has been much more about getting it wrong, about missing the ball, about not issuing accurate ratings, I suppose. Now, I think, and there's a lot of sort of vague accusations made about the quality of Moody's staff and the analysis done there and so on. And I guess I don't really want to sort of deal with this particularly seriously because an IMF report in the wake of the Asia financial crisis said quite conclusively that these stories were unfounded. I mean, obviously everybody got the Asian financial crisis wrong, including the IMF. And the World Bank, but I mean, I think they did. It was quite a serious report at the time, and basically they were just happy to assert or show that most of this complaining was in the nature of noise. But I think more recently, in the case of the global financial crisis, these accusations have morphed into something else, into a concern about conflicts of interest. Right. The argument here, of course, which no doubt you've heard again and again, that the agencies are paid by those whose products they rate. And lo and behold, this was somehow a great revelation, and everybody was supposed to run to the hills and panic and so on. And the suggestion, of course, is that in relation to the subprime system of asset-backed securities, that the credit rating agencies were happy to rate these things as AAA, despite the fact that they were actually supposedly toxic, right? So this is the claim, that the agencies were distorted or perverted by their own pecuniary interests to produce AAA ratings. Right, now I don't really accept this at all, and I think there are good reasons that you shouldn't accept it as well. First of all, the conflict of interest argument I think is very problematic. The agencies have been charging issuers for nearly 4 decades at the point when the financial crisis starts. Logically, one would ask, why make the argument now? Why make the argument in 2007, 2008, when Moody's and S&P had been charging issuers for fees for bond issuance or for the ratings of bond issuance from about 1968? I mean, logically, it's hard to, given all the other crises and all the other events, it does seem a curious claim to suggest that the conflict of interest only emerges in 2007. It's very odd, I think. And I think this is precisely this sort of historical level of understanding that is missing from most of the literature about the rating agencies. I think it's chapter 2 of my book. But really is, I think, missing from most of the economic account and certainly the legal account as well. Now, I would say on conflict of interest that conflict of interests are ubiquitous. If there's all the academics in this room face these conflicts of interest themselves in terms of marking students. Right? Many expensive degrees at this university and at my university. Prima facie, if the rating agencies have a conflict of interest, so do we. And so do those at private schools and so on and so forth. So I think it's how you manage your conflicts of interest that matters. And some of us manage these things well, and I think most universities in the UK manage their conflicts of interest very well. There's very little evidence, I think, direct evidence, as opposed to sort of slander and innuendo, that the rating agencies manage their conflicts of interest any worse. Right? So, I mean, there's just an identification between here's a conflict of interest, here's a scandal, and there's the assumption that there is evidence, and in fact there isn't. I think one of the rather scandalous rating agency hearings conducted in the US Congress involved investigators actually going into the rating agencies and gathering data, gathering emails and that sort of thing. And I think one of them, if you recall, refers to, if it's a cow, we'll rate it or something like that. Now, it's quite interesting because I read those documents, unlike, I'm sure, the senators and most of the people who actually attended that hearing. And if you actually read the documents, if you read the so-called town hall meeting conducted by Ray McDaniel, the CEO of Moody's Corporation, which owns Moody's Investors Service, one of the things that you'll see is the irony of the SEC and other institutions contacting the agencies and asking them desperately to tell these government agencies how the SEC and the other agencies could actually, or the government generally, the US government generally, could actually further regulate the rating agencies. And McDaniel talks about this at length. And of course, needless to say, Henry Waxman, the chair of this committee, doesn't mention this rather revealing fact about the ineptitude of the US government, but also I think about all he wants to highlight in these hearings are, rather fatuous comments by junior analysts, rather than, I think, the more key observation, which is that actually how you regulate institutions like this, which are, after all, not financial institutions, which are not investment advisors, how you do that is actually a problem. And I thought that was very revealing, but of course, as I say, Waxman completely ignores that. It is in the evidence for that particular hearing, but as I say, ignores it. So instead just wants to highlight the sort of trivia, if it's a cow, we'll rate it and so on. Now, I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding or complete lack of understanding of what it is the agencies were actually doing in relation to asset-backed securities. Now, I'm not an apologist for the agencies. My book is actually very critical of the agencies. But I do like to get things right. And I think that what the agencies were actually rating is not what people think that they were rating. Right? People say, how on earth could the agencies rate more asset-backed securities based on houses in East Los Angeles, right? How could they do this? I mean, these are all poor Latinos, blah, 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 ninja loans, yada, yada, yada. We've all heard all this nonsense before. How could this possibly happen, that they would come out with AAA ratings? How could they possibly rate these toxic assets as AAA? They're obviously corrupt. They're obviously this, that, and the other thing. Well, that isn't what they're rating. They're not actually rating the mortgages. I think that's the point. That's the weird thing about this. This shows, I guess, the confusion about asset-backed securities. What they're rating is essentially the sort of legal claims that are attached to the hierarchy of tranches in a trust. And the tranches at the top, the AAA tranches, have the strongest legal claim to this stream of income.